I'm Dr. Marcello Sbrocca. In this video, I'm going to talk about saxophone fingerings. In particular, I'm going to talk about the, I believe it's French, but the French notation or naming scheme that they use for fingerings. I'm then going to talk about some alternate fingerings that you can try on your saxophone to help with common issues, mainly related to pitch. Then I'm going to talk about quarter tone fingerings, and then multiphonics and multiphonic fingerings. And then at the very end I'll have a conclusion to kind of wrap everything up. And as with most of my videos, I'll leave timestamps down below in case you want to skip ahead to a particular chapter in case you're just interested in a particular segment. So anyway, let's start by talking about the common way in so if you're a classical saxophonist, and you're playing music that's written ahead of time, you're using sheet music, oftentimes fingerings are notated a particular way. I believe it's French. I'm not 100% sure, but it doesn't really matter. I'm just going to explain what all those different numbers and letters correspond to fingering-wise on the saxophone. And there is a logic to it, and I'm going to try and bring that out by going over the saxophone in chunks. This will make more sense in a second. So let's start with the most basic part of this fingering system, which is if you see in your sheet music 1 through 6 or 1 through sometimes 7 or 8, all that corresponds to is basically going down a C major scale. A middle B is 1, A is 2, G is 3, F is 4, E is 5, and D is 6. Sometimes a low C is a 7, and sometimes a low B is 8. But typically, 1 through 6 just corresponds to B, A, G, F, E, D. And then the pinkies tend to be grouped together. So nothing special for low C and a D sharp or E flat. That's typically just indicated as a C or D sharp or E flat. And it's typically on the bottom left side because it's mirroring the saxophone. It's mirroring that, as you're seeing the video, you'll see that on the bottom, your bottom left side, my bottom right side, is where my right pinky is, and that touches the C and then the D sharp or E flat key. And then oftentimes on the upper left side for your left pinky, or the upper right side for your left pinky, you'll see B flat, B, C sharp, and G sharp. So nothing special with those. Now we'll talk about all of the alternate fingerings. Like a side B flat, side C, or side F sharp. They're often indicated with T. So a side F sharp, or an alternate F sharp, this key right here, is TF. Capital T, lowercase f. Side B flat is TA, uppercase T, lowercase a, and then side C is TC, capital T, lowercase c. And then we get to, so that's TF, TA, and TC. Then when we get to these upper notes, the kind of palm keys, those are all C. So a high D is C1, D sharp or E flat is C2, and then we go to the right hand, high E is C3, high F is C4, high F sharp is C5, and if you have a modern soprano, high G key will be C6. So very logical, C1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then sometimes 6. The octave key is almost always 8 VE, as it is in many other pieces of music. And then we have two other special keys here, and that is this B flat, this little key right here, this small key is P, lowercase p. I had a professor once tell me that the P stood for petite, as in petite clé, as in small key in French, but it actually means plateau, because the button is like a little plateau on the key. And then last but not least, we have this right here. This is not actually a button, it's a lever. And this is called, which opens up the C4, as well as pressing down on 1 and the small C key. That's a C key, by the way. That's never notated because you never touch that button directly. But anyway, this lever right here is called the X key. Sometimes people call it the forked F key or the front F key, but I much prefer to call it the X key because it does a lot more than play a high F. Anyway, so just to repeat, B all the way down to D, just these 6 main fingers, is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Sometimes low C and B is 7 and 8, but oftentimes low D sharp and C, or E flat and C, are indicated as that D sharp or E flat and C. The left pinky is G sharp, B, C sharp, and B flat. Nothing special there. The alternate keys are TF, TA, TC. All of the high notes are C1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, as that's how they go up. The small B flat key is P, and the lever right here is X. And then of course we have the octave key, which is 8VE oftentimes. Anyway, now we can move on to alternate fingerings. So why would we need alternate fingerings? Well, in general, we use different fingerings to either help us with pitch, timbre, or because it makes a section technically more easy. So a lot of the fingerings that I'm about to give you are mainly alternate fingerings that you can use to help with common pitch problems on the saxophone. When it comes to timbre as well as technique, that gets very subjective. And that's something I'll talk more about at the end. And these alternate fingerings that I'm about to give, they may or may not be helpful for you. You may have been told not to do some of these. You may have tried some of these and not liked them. It's entirely up to you. These are just some of the possibilities that may be beneficial. And lastly, they are by no means all of the different possible alternate fingerings. These are just kind of the ones that I believe are the most common. I'll start low and then I'll go high. So the first alternate fingering, I would say, is with a low D or D sharp or E flat. Now, a low D or D sharp or E flat tends to be a flat note on the saxophone. Not all saxophones, not all brands, not all sizes, but it's not uncommon that note's flat. So what do? I open up a low C sharp. So you may find that if you've never done that before, or if you've never done any of these alternate fingerings before, sometimes they're really easy to do and it takes very little adjustment, if any at all, to get used to them. But some of them you really have to change your voicing and embouchure and air pressure in order to make them work. In other words, you'll have to kind of figure these out. You know, some notes on the saxophone you don't need to do alternate fingerings for, and you shouldn't. You know, you should try to figure it out without changing anything. Oftentimes that produces the best timbre. But some notes on the saxophone, there's just nothing you can do anything about, like a low D and D sharp or E flat. Some saxophones, they're only a little bit flat and you can bring it up, but that's a note that's pretty problematic for some saxophones, and that's why I add and take away the low C sharp. Okay, next I would say the next problematic note would actually be a section, and that's the middle register, going from a low G to a middle C natural. C sharp is another, I'll talk about that after this. If you play a Series 2 or a Series 3 saxophone, the middle register tends to be flat. So flat that most saxophonists can't bring it up in pitch without significantly changing their embouchure and their timbre in kind of a negative way. So for a low G and G sharp, if you find that your low G and G sharp are flat, you can try opening TF. or the alternate F sharp key. Now for A, B flat, and B, some saxophonists will open the G sharp key. And same with C. I don't have to do that on my saxophone, but some saxophones really have a flat middle register and need to do that. Now, middle C sharp is oftentimes a problematic note for most saxophones. Like those other notes, it tends to be flat. And there are multiple alternate fingerings you can use to bring the pitch up of a middle C sharp. You can either, actually on my saxophone I don't really have to do anything, but you can try adding TA and or TC. And if it's really flat, what you can do is you can do octave key and 3. Now, again, I don't have to do that one, but I know a lot of people who do have to do that for a middle C sharp because it can be such a flat note. Okay, moving on. The next section that tends to be problematic is a middle D and D sharp or E flat. So a low D sharp and E flat or D sharp, sorry, a low D natural or D sharp tends to be flat, whereas a middle D natural and D sharp tends to be sharp. What I do, and again, some saxophonists really don't like to do this because they think you should just do it with your embouchure, but some saxophones, like this one, the middle D natural is so sharp that I can sometimes adjust it with my embouchure, but typically I have to put down low B. So. And a middle D sharp, sometimes I'll put the low B down. It doesn't really change the pitch much. If I want to play a middle D sharp and I really need to bring the pitch down and I don't want to use the side fingering, I will put down a low B flat, which is very similar to what I just did. I don't do it all the time, but you know, middle D and D sharp, you can put down a low B for a D and a low B flat for a D sharp or E flat. Now, for those of you who have palm key, like when you're playing a middle D or D sharp or E with palm keys like this, for some people, those can be sharp. For some people, they can be flat. If it's flat, sometimes there's not much you can do about it, but if it's sharp, like sometimes, depending on the mouthpiece I'm playing or the reed, a middle D, which is just C2, can be sharp. And what I would do is I would put down 2. And sometimes D sharp, which is C4, you can try 1 or 2. And typically for an E, which I don't play that often, that one's almost never flat. For most people, they have to open all C1 through 5 to get an E, but on my saxophone it's a 2. But if it's still sharp or still flat after you've opened all of them, there's not really much you can do except maybe open TC, but that would be unusual. Okay, so going on from the middle D and D sharp or E flat, whether it be the side or the regular fingering, a problematic note for some saxophones can be an F natural, middle F natural, or F sharp. Typically, if that note is at a tune, then maybe you just need to adjust your saxophone. But I personally find that sometimes a middle F natural or F sharp is sharp when I'm trying to play quiet, no matter what. And so what I'll do is I'll put down a low C. That's typically only when I'm trying to play really quiet. And most saxophones you don't need to do this on, but it's just a possibility. The next problematic note might be a high A through C sharp. So high A, high B flat, and a high C, if you find those notes to be sharp constantly, and there's nothing you can do about it. Sometimes you can put down 6. Now I say you can't do that for a high B because if you put 6 down, it'll close P. But otherwise, you can try. I don't do this. I think you should try to do this with your embouchure, but again, you can put down 6. Sometimes if you have to play a high C really quietly, you could play a bis B-flat fingering, which is 1 and P together and side C. Next, if a very common note that's out of tune on the saxophone is a high C sharp. Some saxophones it's pretty in tune, but on a lot of saxophones, especially older saxophones, it's very sharp. What I do is I put down 4. So to me it helps a lot. Some people prefer to put down just 5 or just 6, or some people like to put down the entire right hand of 4, 5, and 6. I prefer just to do 4 because I don't think the timbre is better with all 3 down, but that's up to you. Now going on to palm keys, high D, you could put down, if that note is consistently sharp, you can put down 4 as well, just like with C sharp. High E flat, sometimes you can put down one of these. You can put down 2, but that's typically only if that note is really sharp, or sometimes you can drop C1. High E, you can drop C1 as well. High F, you can drop C1 and or C2. And same for high F sharp. Okay, so in general, those are some of the common alternate fingerings that people use for common pitch issues on the saxophone. Now, maybe you don't even find most of those to be necessary to you, or maybe you find that those alternate fingerings are not useful to you except in certain situations. And so you have to kind of decide that. You know, do I need to do this alternate fingering all the time, or is it just in very particular situations? For example, the high C sharp on this saxophone, which this is a Yamaha Custom EX silver-plated first series, the high C sharp is very sharp. So no matter the situation, I always put down 4 when I play high C sharp. You have to look at it like that is the high C sharp fingering for this saxophone. Otherwise, you'll just be playing sharp all the time. You know, you have to have that habit. That is my high C sharp fingering, not that. Same with middle D natural. I always have to put down B. You know, low D, I always have to open up C sharp. But, you know, if I'm playing a high note, I may or may not need to, you know, use an alternate fingering for a high C or something like that. So, again, you have to decide that. And now we're going to talk about quarter tones and quarter tone fingerings. Quarter tones, there are oftentimes misconceptions with quarter tones because people will just look at a piece of music, and sometimes there's a recommended fingering for a quarter tone, and they'll just play it, and they don't even see if it's the correct pitch or anything, and that they just stick with that. And that's kind of a problem. In fact, there's 2 main problems with quarter tones. One is that people are not actually playing the correct pitch because they're just trusting whatever fingering is on the page, or they're just kind of being a little lazy in trying to figure out what's the right fingering. Or another common issue with quarter tones is people will change the timbre of the note too much. So let me give an example. Let's say, for example, the second movement of the Sonata for Saxophone and Piano by Edison Denisov. There are some quarter tones in that. And oftentimes, when people play those quarter tones, either they're not actually achieving the correct pitch, or when they do play the quarter tone fingering, they're changing the timbre so much. This is problematic for two reasons. Number one, they're not playing the right note because they're not actually playing a quarter tone. And number two, when it's like all the composer is asking for is for you to play a particular pitch. They're not asking for you to play some different timbre. When you play an alternate fingering and it really changes the timbre of the saxophone, unless you know the composer wants that, all it's doing is distracting from what the phrase is actually trying to achieve. I'll try and give an example. I'll play a F sharp down to a quarter tone sharp F to an F natural. So if I was just going down and I wanted it to just kind of be a descending legato phrase, it would be something like this. If I was doing it and I was getting carried away with the timbre, or I wasn't paying attention to the timbre that the quarter note created, it would sound something like this. So I exaggerated it, but you see how oftentimes these quarter tone fingerings, they're forcing you to play the saxophone in a way it wasn't designed. It's making you play the saxophone in a way that's oftentimes not very resonant. And so if it's a situation where you want that resonance, you have to figure out a way with your embouchure and your voicing to make the note more resonant. Hence why, instead of letting the note kind of get pale, I push a little bit. And so on. Also, use a tuner and see if you're actually getting a quarter tone. On your teacher's saxophone or in the recommended fingering, that might work for some people, that particular fingering, but maybe on your saxophone you need to figure something else out. So again, just to recap with quarter tones, make sure that the fingering you're using actually produces the note written, and make sure that whatever timbre it creates actually goes along with the music. It should not distract from what's going on in the music unless the composer wants that. Just to give an example, in Luciano Berio's Seventh Sequenza, he has melodies that are created out of timbre. In that piece, there's 6 different fingerings for a middle C sharp, and they all have different levels of resonance. Some are very pale and some are very bright. And he uses that to kind of create melodies out of timbre. That's a situation where you want the fingering to have a particular timbre. But in, for example, the second movement of the Denisov Sonata, for those of you who are familiar with it, you don't want that. That's not what's indicated. It's just a quarter tone. That's it. So don't let the quarter note or the quarter tone distract from the phrasing and the musicality that's already going on. Similarly, multiphonics are kind of the same way. In multiphonics, as opposed to quarter tone fingerings, there's basically always a fingering written in. A composer would never write notes in and assume that you knew what the correct fingering would be for the multiphonic. And for those of you who don't know, multiphonics is where you're playing multiple notes at once. So the first step with multiphonics is to make sure that the fingering in the music actually creates the multiphonic written. Sometimes the notes are really important, and sometimes the timbre created from the fingering is really important. You have to figure that out. Sometimes it's very obvious, and sometimes it isn't. And when it isn't obvious, you need to try and do both. What do I mean by that? You need to take the multiphonic fingering, play it, and see if you can isolate each of the individual notes on on the page. You know, if it has a low F sharp, a high G, and a high C sharp, you need to play the fingering and try to, with your embouchure and your voicing, you need to try to achieve all of those notes individually. You may find that you can get two of those notes, but then the third one is a half step sharp or flat or something like that. And so you need to change a key, you need to change the fingering so you can actually get those notes. Now, multiphonics are never something that's terribly precise, so in my opinion, typically if you're within a quarter tone of the pitch, I kind of say that's good. Secondly, let's say let's say the fingering indicated does actually achieve all the pitches. Then you need to decide, how do I play this multiphonic? It is so unfortunately common that when people see a multiphonic fingering, it's either on or off with the note. They're not thinking in nuance anymore. Maybe because multiphonic is such a novel thing. Same with quarter tones. But you have to decide musically what makes the most sense. I'll give an example. I'll play an extremely common multiphonic, which is a low C with 4 off. Oftentimes, people play this multiphonic like this. There's no nuance. It's either on or off. It's a pretty overused multiphonic, in my opinion. It was one of the kind of first multiphonics, and it's found in a lot of different pieces of music. But you need to decide, do I want it to sound like that, or do I want it to sound like this? So multiphonics can have all sorts of colors and nuance to them, and it's up to you to decide what fits the music the best. Don't fall into the trap of one size fits all with anything in music, but especially with multiphonics. You have to find what fits the music the best. Okay, now I'm going to conclude this video by talking about my general attitude and approach to the many different possibilities of fingerings on the saxophone. And this is with regards to, the different fingerings you'd use either for timbre, pitch, or technique. Now, to give an example for technique, there's a lot of, I don't know if I'd call it debate, but there's a lot of opinions around which B-flat fingering to use when, going up and down the saxophone. Some people love bis B-flat, which is 1 and P, and some people love side B-flat, which is 1, 2, and TA. Some people say that, why does the saxophone have these alternate fingerings if you're not going to use them? Alternate as in, you have the alternate F sharp key, TF, alternate B flat key, TA, and alternate C key, TC. We have that so that we don't have to go have contrary motion, they say one of the reasons that the mechanism on the saxophone is so special is that we have things like that, among some other things. But, I've had teachers who had incredible technique, who their favorite way to go from a B flat to a B was sliding their finger up and down P. Now, on my saxophone, I can't go down to it because my finger will get stuck in between 1 and P. But if I go up, that works just fine. But you have to practice that. But some saxophonists are very proficient at doing that, and they much prefer it over this because you have to move more keys. Maybe they find it clunky. Who knows? And just for reference, so I studied with Arne Bornkamp at one point, a phenomenal classical saxophonist. He loved the side fingerings. That was his thing. He really wanted his students to do that, and he made it work very well, and his students could make it work very well. I also studied with Vincent David, another wonderful classical saxophonist. Some of the greatest technique I've ever seen on a saxophonist since, Charlie Parker. Just truly incredible. And for him, you could take off his TA key. He's so, I'm not saying he never uses alternate keys, but he was much more a fan of sliding up and down P than using the side B flat. So what I'm trying to say is, a lot of things can work, It's not like you have to pick one system or one attitude of fingerings over another. And this kind of gets me to my conclusion here. What matters most is that you really believe in that fingering and you commit to it. For example, I gave that example earlier of how people will argue, why does the saxophone have all these side keys if people aren't going to use it? They were invented to make it so you wouldn't have to have contrary motion and stuff like that. But if you look at flutists, who have sometimes incredible technique and are very smooth, they do have a lot of B flat fingerings, but they don't have a good alternate F sharp fingering like we do, or B to C. I don't think they do. And they can play very well. And then, as I just mentioned, Vincent David, somebody with unbelievable technique, he doesn't use side fingerings all the time. He certainly still uses them. But he can have some of the greatest technique I've ever seen in my life. So what matters most is that you stay open-minded, and you try the different fingerings out. But what's most important is that you believe in the fingerings you're using and you just commit to them. It's like you play your worst when you don't trust what you're doing. Like if anybody has ever played in a large group and somebody called you out for playing out of tune, you could have barely played out of tune, or maybe it was just one note. But if you couldn't tell when you played out of tune, now you're going to be extremely self-conscious that, oh no, I'm playing out of tune and I didn't know it. Maybe I'm totally unaware, what else is wrong? And then you play your worst because you're really self-conscious. It's the same thing with fingerings. Now, there are fingerings out there that are truly objectively better than others. There are certain situations where you really should be using one fingering over another. There are certain saxophones out there that you could be a really great saxophonist and it would still make a lot more sense to do an alternate fingering over just playing the fingering normally. And you're the one who has to figure that out. But it makes a very big difference whether or not you trust it and are committed to it or not. And lastly, I did not talk about altissimo fingerings in this video because I already have a video dedicated to that on how to play altissimo on the saxophone. But if you have some altissimo questions anyway, you can put them down below, or you want to know my fingerings that I use for a particular note, you can ask me away. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching this video. Please comment or put any questions down below if you have any, and I'll see you guys in the next video.